Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we are going to talk to an illustrator of children's books whose name is Brian Selznick. We might add right after that the very much honored Brian Selznick, winner of a Caldecott honor a couple of books ago. We're not going to talk about that book so much today. We're going to talk about his newest, Walt Whitman, Words for America. And the book text is written by Barbara Kerley, and it's published by Scholastic Press. Thanks for coming by.
Oh, thanks for having me.
To get into some of your old books, just so people know that you're the same God. With Pam Munoz Ryan, you did a book called Amelia and Eleanor Go for a Ride.
Yeah, about Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right. That was, 1999?
Yeah, I think so.
Good Lord, that's a long time ago. And then more recently, 2002, again with Pam Munoz Ryan, When Marian Sang.
Yeah, about the opera singer Marian Anderson.
Okay. And then a book that we had you on the show for.
Yes.
With the same Barbara Kerley, The Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins.
Yes.
Which is one of the most fascinating books and fascinating research adventures. You're being challenged by a goose in a lonely place in England, as I recall.
But that's another story.
That's another story that I love, but I don't want to go into here. There's good news, prize-wise, on this book, too, on very soon, in the month of November, I think, you will be named, or this book will be named, one of the 10 best illustrated children's books of the year. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Now, it seems to me that when we talk about this book, one of the fascinating things about it is its genesis. Its genesis was in a medallion that you sent to Barbara Kerley.
Yeah, every year for the holidays, I make little ornaments, little medallions.
Mm-hmm.
And each year there's a different theme. And that year, an uncle of mine had passed away, and he really loved butterflies. And so I wanted to do something with a butterfly in his honor. And I went on Google internet search picture, looking for butterflies. And in the thousands of pictures of butterflies, I saw this picture of Whitman where he's in profile and he's holding a butterfly on his finger.
It's a fairly famous photo.
Yeah, I had never seen it before.
It seems to me I've seen it before in textbooks and stuff like that.
Yeah, I had never seen it before. It turns out it's also a sort of a controversial photograph because he said it was a real butterfly on his finger, but it's quite clear that it's a paper butterfly that is cut out and glued to his finger.
Oh, fudge.
And I used that as the basis for this medallion. I had never really read much of Walt Whitman, but I always liked the idea of who Walt Whitman was, what he represented. But it was really more for the butterfly that I used him on the medallion. And I sent them out, and when Barbara got hers, turns out she had always wanted to do a book about Walt Whitman, and this came as a little sign from above for her that's told her to get working on this book about Walt Whitman.
That's absolutely amazing.
Made me very happy.
Yeah. One of the things that I'll always remember you for is that when you sit down to illustrate a book, you dig in. You go out and you do research. What was the research like on this one?
Barbara had, the good thing about illustrating is when another person has written it, is that they've started doing the research.
That's right. They kind of narrow the field.
So I've got a big leg up when I'm working with authors who have done a lot of research. And so Barbara sent me all of the stuff that she had researched. And for my drawings, I find it very important to travel to places that the people who I work with have, where they've lived, where they've worked. And so I got to go to Whitman's birth home in Melville, Long Island, Huntington, Long Island.
Whatever.
It's all sort of mixed together there.
Disputed place,
yes.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderfully preserved home. It still has some of the original furniture from when he was there, and there's a really nice visitor center and amazing experts there who were able to help me on my way, give me certain books to read and give me images, and I took a lot of photographs. Originally, I thought the birth home was going to appear in the beginning of the book, and that ended up getting cut. But just having been there became a very important part of beginning the process. And I also spent some time in Camden, New Jersey, where he spent the last 12 years of his life.
Right.
And that is now also a museum and is still filled with the furniture that was surrounding him when he was alive. And he's buried about a mile away from there, and his grave is really beautiful. And he designed it himself. It's based on a drawing by William Blake. And that grave itself is now the last thing that you see in the book on the back end papers.
Right,
we visit Whitman's grave.
One of the other places you went to was the New York Public Library, the rare book section, and you actually held in your hand one of his handmade notebooks?
He used to cut out pieces of paper and sew them together and make these little notebooks that he would carry with him that would, would serve for notes for all of his poems, and he would keep them, and I got to touch one of them. It was really, and flip through it. It was amazing.
Oh my gosh. Was the writing legible?
Barely, but if you looked very carefully, you could make out what he was saying.
Okay, now we know what's behind the book, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time and find out what's inside Walt Whitman, Words for America.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. Today we are spending time with Brian Selznick, who is the illustrator of a new book, Walt Whitman, Words for America, text by Barbara Kerley, a book about which the Bible of the publishing industry has in part this to say. The heart of this story centers on the wrenching, though inspiring effects the Civil War had on Whitman, who, too old to enlist in the Union Army, traveled to Virginia to stay with his wounded younger brother, then spent years caring for other hospitalized, often dying soldiers, the source of some of his most memorable verse. And now to the illustrator. Selznick's versatile illustrations encompass a stark realism, sepia-tone daguerreotypes,
early photographs
of Civil War soldiers based on actual photographs, and surreal whimsy as Whitman walks in the country by moonlight. The sky above is filled with open notebooks bearing words from his writing. Copious quotes from his poems and correspondence let Whitman's eloquent voice resonate through the pages, and bountiful source notes remove any doubt of these talented collaborator affection and admiration for their subject. Their enthusiasm is convincing and contagious. And I wanted to get that in because there is in this book, as with the other one that you did with Barbara, there's a very, in my judgment, good sense of balance between writer and illustrator. You seem always to be comfortable with each other. You seem always to be on the same page, so to speak. And I suppose it is right to say that the heart of the story, for most readers, myself included, is the Civil War part and what it meant to Whitman's life and writing. But the book itself, thank you, begins much earlier. Whitman is 12, and what's he doing?
He's a printer's apprentice. He started off working in a print shop, and it was his job to typeset the articles, and he had to individually take each backwards letter they were all made out of metal, put them in the composing stick, and start making the type case, putting them in the type box that would then be printed.
The illustration for that is wonderfully accurate in all kinds of detail. I know that you did a great deal of research on what that composing box would look like. But the other thing that's great about it is he's full of black ink.
Yeah, I figured
he's a real mess.
Yeah, I figured he's 12. He's probably going to have some ink on him.
Yeah. Now, he then goes on, he reads a lot, eventually publishes his own little newspaper, and his brother looks like he's the one who does the delivering of it.
Some of the heavy lifting.
And then he starts writing, and there are two-facing illustrations which show where he got his inspiration from as an early writer, and actually this is what inspired him throughout his life. On the left-hand page is a young Walt Whitman in a busy city scene, and on the right-hand page is a young Walt Whitman apparently with no clothes on, running around on the beach.
Yeah, not in the city scene.
Not in the city. The beach, yes.
He has stripped to swim, and he is shouting Shakespeare to the seagulls, which apparently is something that he liked to do. And Barbara, in her text, was talking about how he was inspired by all the different kinds of people that he saw on the street, the rich people and the poor people and the working people, but also nature was so important to him and to his writing. And so this was a way for us to begin looking at those two elements in his poetry.
In every leaf and blade of grass, Whitman felt America's grace and vigor.
Yeah,
and that's the great one. That's so constant with him. All right, his own poems are free ranging. They're kind of against the grain of poetry at the time. He encounters slavery in his travels, and then comes the Civil War.
Yeah.
And Whitman is 41 years old. He's too old to serve, and he becomes, I guess, what we'd call a nurse.
Yeah, his brother was injured in the war, and Whitman tracked him down. And his brother was okay; he just had been injured in the cheek. But he began to see all of these young injured soldiers all around him, and he was very, very moved. And even when George went back to continue fighting, Whitman stayed behind, and he wasn't a trained nurse in any way, but he could offer comfort. He was able to change bandages. He was able to wash the soldiers. He was able to talk to them. He was able to give them small gifts. And I think most importantly, he was able to write for them. He was able to write letters home to their parents. A lot of them didn't know how to read or write. And he would often stay up late at night so that soldiers wouldn't have to die by themselves. And then he would write letters home to their parents, telling them that that he was with them when their child died, and talk about their bravery and their strength.
One of the things he says about himself, I think that I was a help to them, but I didn't really know why.
Yeah.
And it could be that old wonderful thing of just being present.
Just being with somebody. He had to do it.
All right, enough of the story of Walt Whitman, Words for America. We'll talk next about the illustrations, and maybe we'll find out in looking at them what we haven't left the story behind.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast. The book today, Walt Whitman, Words for America. The author, Barbara Kerley, with us, the illustrator, a prize winner again this year, one of the 10 best children's illustrated books of the year, New York Times. And that man is Brian Selznick. And the San Francisco Chronicle said, Caldecott honor-winning illustrator Selznick, the dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins, contributes warm, engaging paintings that capture the wonder of the young Whitman, the passion of the wandering Whitman, and the compassion of the Civil War-era Whitman. Altogether, an outstanding picture biography. So that's what we think of you locally. I look at this book, and I, have some knowledge of books that you've done in the past, and I say to myself, this has got to have been a more difficult task than other things. And the reason I say that is that you're working here with a degree of abstraction that you weren't working with before. Waterhouse Hawkins, he did these darn,
big old dinosaurs.
And Marian Anderson, there's a political context to that. And here, there is the life and the poetry of probably America's finest poet, and how the devil do you capture that?
It's a picture book about words, and so
yes, it's really, very good. Yeah,
it's
actually,
very difficult to do that, and I think that a lot of the process for me of figuring out how I wanted to illustrate was figuring out how to balance the language with the images. And when the story begins, when we see Walt Whitman as a kid printing, which we talked about a little bit earlier, opposite that, I made the words really large so that visually they had an equal amount of weight with the image, so that right when we begin, we could understand that the words are as important as the pictures in this picture book.
Well, there's proof positive of that on a spread, which we talked about, where there are words positioned on books floating in a star-filled, moonlit sky, and Whitman walking underneath.
Yeah, Whitman's beginning in the text on this page is talking about Whitman publishing Leaves of Grass, his book of poetry for the first time, trying to capture America, and it's a book he reworked for the rest of his life. Mm-hmm. And I was originally going to draw Whitman at the printing press, making the book in the beginning, but it seemed like it needed to go into something more abstract, something slightly more magical and more spiritual. And so that's what led me to this idea of these floating notebooks above him. And then each of those words on the notebooks, if you read them across the sky, say, "Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems."
Does this get it or not? And then there's an explosive 2-page spread, and the caption on it is all the words: "The Civil War, 1861." And this comes at you like an explosion, like a total interruption in this man's life. When I read it first, I said, "Oh my gosh, we're going to have another book."
Yeah, and that was exactly my intention. So I felt like this, when the Civil War begins, everything changes. It changes America. It changes Whitman's life specifically. And I felt like we needed to start a new book in a way. And so it's this sort of strange yellow-filled sky with battles going on underneath it.
Yeah. And then we really get into the Civil War, and there's a picture of what are these figures? These are soldiers?
Yeah, in a scene that echoes some of the earlier daguerreotypes, there are now, later in the war, slightly larger daguerreotypes of injured soldiers, and some of them have amputations and bandages, and they're each holding chalkboards. And the chalkboards were used so that they could identify themselves with their names and with their regiment.
Yeah.
And what I did, it's rows and rows of these daguerreotypes, and in one of the spaces we see Whitman giving one of the young soldiers a gift, but on those chalkboards I put some single words so that, again, when you read them across all of the pictures and you look at these bright white words on the chalkboards, it again is another line of Whitman's poetry. "Oh, my soldiers, my veterans, my heart gives you love." And I felt like it was really important, as much as possible, to work his language directly into the images.
Tragedy comes upon Walt Whitman and the country. Lincoln is assassinated. And there's a black 2-page spread with a picture of Whitman sitting in a chair at a table with a candlelight or a lamp, and he's apparently writing. The facing page is all black and has reverse type on it, and it has part of his most famous poem, "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack. The prize we sought is won," and so forth and so on. When I finished the book, I said to myself, if you're a stranger to Walt Whitman, this is your book, a place to start. If he's an old friend, this book it's supposedly for kids, and it'll enhance and renew your experience. In either case, buy it, love it, give it. Walt Whitman, Words for America, illustrator, Brian Selznick, author, Barbara Kerley. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.